Hello, welcome to Global Studies with Ms. Pritchard. This video is for Global 2 students, and it is going to cover the economic imperialism of the U.S. in Latin America and the Pacific, and Japan's imperialism in the Pacific. All right, independent Latin America. They have a colonial legacy, which meant they had a plantation system, which keeps a majority of the people poor. Land is left unused due to lack of labor. Caudillos, those are military dictators, take over the government. And that leads to political instability because keep in mind, if most of the people are poor and a lot of the land is unused due to lack of labor, it's because people are poor and starving, so they're not going to be happy and they'll fight. There is a huge gap between the rich and the poor, which leads to further economic instability. So overall, you have political instability, you have economic instability, there's going to be lots of problems. And a lot of that goes back to the social structure they had under colonialism. All right, economic imperialism. It is all about markets. The independent nations could trade with anyone, and colonial powers did not develop industry, which means these new nations are relying simply on their natural resources because they have no domestic industry to develop them. So they're selling their resources to foreigners to then turn them into finished products. This leads to a trade imbalance so that Latin American countries are buying more than they are selling. So that's going to add to their economic problems. And foreign nations do begin to develop the infrastructure, and they loan the new nations money, which puts them in debt and prevents further economic development. So a lot of it goes back to the fact that they don't have the things they need to make use of the resources they have in a modern industrial economy. All right, the Monroe Doctrine is what shapes much of the interaction between the U.S. and Latin America, and which pretty much means the U.S. is in control because it's the strongest in terms of politics, military, and economics in the 19th century. So the Monroe Doctrine told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Cuba declares independence from Spain, and the U.S. supports the Cubans, which leads to the Spanish-American War. In that war, the U.S. wins several colonies from Spain, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The U.S. goes on to build the Panama Canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which improves trade. And then in the early 20th century, we get the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which says the U.S. will act as the police of the Western Hemisphere. In other words, we will interfere and solve any problems that we see developing. All right, now we move on to Japan. Now, Japan opened to Western trade. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sails into Tokyo Harbor with a fleet of modern U.S. warships, and he has a letter from President Fillmore to the Tokugawa shogun, and he requests open trade. Now, at first, the shogun's like, yeah, I don't think so. But then Matthew Perry shows him the warships and all of their guns and says, you know what? I'm going to come back in a year and ask you again. So in 1854, we get the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opens trade between the U.S. and Japan. And Japan does that to avoid war with the better armed U.S. Navy. Now, what you have to understand is that in 1854, Japan was still a feudal dictatorship. They have an emperor who is the leader, but it is the shogun and the samurai warriors that have the real power. The real person in control of Japan was the shogun, and he operated much like an absolute monarch. All right, so we get the Meiji Restoration after that. The Japanese are upset with the shogun for giving in to the Western powers, so they start to appeal to the young emperor. And when I say young, he was in his teens. In 1867, the Tokugawa shogun steps down and the emperor takes control of the government. And he chooses to call his reign Meiji, which means enlightened rule. And he goes on to send diplomats and scholars to the U.S. and Europe to learn everything they can about modernization because he feels that is the way that Japan will get ahead. All right, so modernization in Japan. They take the ideas from the West and adapt them to their culture. So they really like the way that the German government operates, so they model their constitution after that. They also appreciate the German military discipline and the power of the British Navy, so that's how they model their military. And they take over the universal public education idea from the US, so they send all of their children to school. And as they're doing that, they also build up an infrastructure of roads and railways to support their industry. An excellent movie about this process because it did not go easily in Japan. Think about the fact that the samurais were in control for 600 years and suddenly they have no power. If you want to see that in an excellent movie, The Last Samurai shows that conflict. All right, so this ends with an imperial Japan. By 1894, Japan had gained enough military, economic, and political power that the Western nations give up their extraterritorial rights. In other words, they start to follow Japanese laws. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Japanese laws were very similar to European and American laws. All right, so since Japan has limited natural resources because they're islands, they start to take over territory to get natural resources. They initially take over Korea, which gets them into a war with China, and they defeat China. And then they start to take over some land to the north of their islands, which gets them into a war with Russia, and they defeat Russia as well. And that was really what was a huge blow to the Europeans because they viewed it as Russia should have totally been able to beat those little Asian guys. And that's not the way it worked out. So that's what starts to turn that whole racism assumption that the Europeans have upside down. All right, so this is it for the economic imperialism. Make sure you have your notes in your notebook and you show me for credit.